Dawoon lay sprawled on the ground, his body battered and drained, each breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind raced, struggling to piece together what had just happened. As he lifted his gaze, his eyes widened in horror. His chest heaved as he fought for air, his mouth agape in disbelief. Pain surged through him as he glanced down at the iron spikes impaling his body, his skin slick with blood. His teeth clenched tightly, the taste of metal and fear. The realization hit him he was trapped inside a dungeon. Above the pit, his friends leaned over the edge, shouting his name in desperation. Their voices barely reached him, muffled by the heavy air. From the shadows, a rabbit figure chuckled darkly, mocking them. Trap 7 still works like a charm, it sneered, enjoying their panic. His friends were baffled and angry, struggling to comprehend how there was yet another trap at the dungeon's base. Frustration grew among them, indignation boiling over. Something this dangerous should have been warned. The archer clutched his weapon tightly and looked at his embittered friend, who was peering into the hole where his friend lay. The archer shouted to his friend named Su that they were running out of time as the enemies were already approaching them. Sumu was very angry because he realized that he could not help his friend. Sumu anxiously turned towards the pit, preparing to leave. He apologized to Dawn with a shake of his head and was about to leave, was thinking deeply about whether people really die this way, covered in blood. Dawn grabbed the iron bars and tried to stand up, experiencing severe pain. He clutched the iron rod tightly with his hand full of blood and sobbed heavily. Being completely covered in blood, he climbed out of the trap and leaned his hand on the ground, greatly indignant at the situation. His hand shook violently as he pressed it against the ground, bleeding. He felt that his senses were dulled and that he had lost too much blood. It dawned on him that now this whole situation seemed unreal to him and he could not believe it. The devastated protagonist, with a suffering look, twisted his face greatly in pain. Inside heavily, he felt that everything was different from reality. From the very beginning, right from the very moment, he was called into this terrible world. He realized that it was then that this cruel reality began. Fast forward to a month ago, Dawoon walked along a crowded sidewalk and talked on the phone with his hands in his pockets. From the day when he still knew nothing and was forcibly summoned to a known world called the Dungeons, he suddenly widened his eyes and removed the phone from his ear. As a blue aura began to appear next to him, a portal with a blue light appeared right below him and was about to suck him in. He looked frantically as his silhouette began to evaporate, and he did not understand what was happening. He bared his teeth violently as he was completely absorbed by the teleportation path. The blue hologram and portal pixels represented a teleport. The blue space of the portal found itself in a forested area hidden by dense trees. Dawoon landed on the ground after teleportation, experiencing overload. He raised his head and saw a crowd of people who were carefully examining him. A group of people, among whom stood a guy with glasses and a telephone, looked wearily at the new guest. They realized that another person had appeared here, and they were trying to understand what was happening around them. At that time, Suwoo's friend, still unknown to the protagonist, looked at the guy carefully, thinking about whether all the people around him were under hypnosis. Dawn sighed heavily and, sweating, looked at the people from under his brows with a bit of fear. He did not understand what was happening around him and why all the people had gathered here. Dawoon stood up and looked carefully at the indignant crowd of people who were holding their heads. The guy in the suit was very shocked by what was happening, realizing that he was going for an interview and found himself in an incomprehensible place. Another guy in a white t-shirt was trying to peer at his phone, trying to see if he could pinpoint his location on the maps. A notification popped up, congratulating them on being welcomed into the dungeon. Suddenly, Dawoon turned back with a slight fright, frowning deeply. A white rabbit wearing a suit had appeared in front of them, emitting a bright aura. He introduced himself as a guide for this game, noting that all these people were invited to the game. The rabbit put his hand to his cheek and asked the guys if they were curious about what kind of game awaited them. He decided to answer this question himself and explained that people were obviously curious, and he was going to explain everything to them. The protagonist, along with other people, peered ahead with bewilderment and sweat, trying to understand what kind of toy rabbit was in front of them. The guy in the suit got very angry and started walking forward towards the guide, trying to ask him what it was. The man in the suit frowned deeply and shouted angrily that he didn't really understand what kind of show it was or not, but he didn't care about some kind of game. He added that he was late for an important interview. The rabbit looked a little surprised. The man ordered the rabbit to stop hiding behind a toy hare and stop talking nonsense, wanting to personally meet with the organizer of this whole show. The guide extended his hand forward with a slight ironic smile, noting that there was no trick here. He explained that he was going to say something very important, adding that there were no other people here besides them. The guide spread his arms to the sides, one of which held a red umbrella. He asked for people's attention and was about to explain the rules of the game to them when the guys looked at him angrily. The guy in the suit grabbed the rabbit by the jacket and angrily told him to shut up. The guy told the rabbit to talk nonsense and asked him to call a taxi or another car. At the same time, the guy grinned maliciously and began to explain that first, he would tell them of the rules of the game. He immediately grinned maliciously. Dawoon looked at the rabbit with sweat and great surprise as he explained that this would be a game that one learns to play through death. Dawn decided to get closer to the guy who continued to hold the animated rabbit. The guide said it would be a dungeon game. The man in the suit continued to look angrily at the rabbit, which he raised above his head. The rabbit explained that for the sake of the impatient man, he would first have to tell about the most important rules of the game because there was no one here except himself and these people. Dawn reflected that he honestly thought he was dreaming the whole thing. The rabbit noted the first rule: you must always behave slightly with the guide in the game. The rabbit waved his hand sharply and was about to deal a crushing blow to the guy. The guide looked bloodthirsty at the guy whom he hit hard and blood sprayed from his head. He added that it was worth being polite if they valued their lives. Yet Dawn realized that it was not a dream. Splashes of blood scattered in all directions, landing on the face of the main character, who bulged his eyes from what was happening. The guide began to land on the ground as the man's bloody body fell to the ground, and the entire crowd of people realized what was happening in fear. The guide turned to the group and asked if they all saw what he had just done, reminding them that he had killed a man. He added with a chilling calmness that anyone who didn't follow his rules would meet the same fate. Fear instantly washed over the crowd. Their faces went pale as they stood frozen, some instinctively clutching their heads, struggling to process that they had just witnessed a murder. The guide, bloodthirsty, stained with blood, a dead man in a suit lay with his eyes open on the ground in a pool of his blood. The guide explained that it was a game that one learns to play through death. It was still a reality they had to accept. Dawoon collapsed, his body trembling as he sank to the ground. With his hands pressed against the dirt, he stared somberly at the man's lifeless body. Meanwhile, the rest of the group scattered, fleeing without a second glance. The blood-soaked rabbit, removing his hat, calmly lifted a blood-stained finger. He warned that the area was perilous, and now that he had declared himself their guide, he intended to provide them with some essential gear. Dawoon sat on the ground, looking dumbfounded, and saw a small knife appear in front of him. Other people looked in amazement as various weapons began to appear in their hands. An older man in a suit noted that it was virtual reality, which was so popular now, and believed that all these people were actually 3D. While the rabbit was jumping on the ground, he heard people talking about what was happening. One of the guys noted that he once read an article about how false memories are created using virtual reality and passed off as passing a real test. The guy jumped high into the air, looking down at the people. He told them that they could think whatever they wanted and explained that it was worth starting to play a little. People were surprised that the rabbit could fly. The guide looked down at the people. Bloodthirstiest appeared in front of the players. Every minute, different monsters crawled out of the darkness. Monsters with tentacles grabbed people. He recalled how a bunch of dead people fell into death traps. Monsters with tentacles continued to attack the remaining people. Time passed and people continued to die, and if he was careless, he died. He made a mistake and also died. Sometimes there were situations where it was necessary to kill each other in order to survive, and it was a game of survival. One guy kicked the main character, trying to take resources from him. The protagonist, in front of whom was a blue screen, looked dumbfounded at a man with glasses who was greedily eating a piece of meat. Dawn turned to the guy in alarm, telling him that they left this food for everyone. The guy was perplexed, noting that Dawoon was of no use. Dawoon hung his head in disappointment while, in front of the inventory screen, the guy told him that fighters like him risk their lives to protect pathetic guys like Dawn who didn't even know how to fight. He explained that if Dawn was told to bring something, then he had to give it away silently, without any strange exclamations. 2 glowing skill cards appeared. These were skills, another weapon provided by the participants in the dungeon game. He imagined a black image of a man who radiated a yellow aura from himself. It was a thing that Dawn often saw in MMO works that brought out superpowers and could grant superpowers or magical skills. Most people acquired the skills to fight. Dawoon sadly realized his situation while looking at his status window. Its status window named on physical strength 67 100ths, feeling of satiety 34 100ths, skills. Cleansing Beginner 2 cleans contaminated areas. His gaze was drawn specifically to the cleansing skill. He realized that this was a minor skill that did not help in battle, but was merely a skill for removing poisonous impurities from the meat of animals and monsters. The guy with glasses looked at the guy, gloatingly disgusted with him. He explained that he had to be able to thank them because if he had not been with them, he would have lost on the first day. He added that Dawn was of no use but was only wasting food. He arrogantly told him to say thank you for being able to move freely at all. Suwu watched as the meat guy slapped Don. The guy noted that if Dawoon had even a drop of conscience, he would give his share to them. Sumu asked about what they were doing. The nasty guy with glasses and Don turned towards Suwu, who explained that they had agreed to distribute the food the next day. Sumu glared at the guy, who grinned ironically while scratching the back of his head. He replied that today was a hot battle, so he was going to regain his strength a little. Sumu clarified that there were no exceptions. Sumu widened his eyes and menacingly told the guy to wait for tomorrow's distribution. Suwu and Dawn watched as the guy got very angry and was about to leave. Suwu lent a helping hand to Dawoon and asked him if he was okay. Dawn thanked his defender with joy on his face. Sumu looked at his friend with slight concern, so that he wouldn't think about it because everyone just became rude. That's why this happened. Sumu looked at the guy who laughed lightly and scratched the back of his head. He replied that he hadn't thought about it and that everything was fine. Sumu told Dawn to get some sleep as they would be performing early tomorrow morning. He recalled the guide's words that tomorrow they should reach their final destination. Dawoon raised his eyebrows and looked at his defender in awe. He understood that he would also like to help in some way. He looked sarcastically at his knife, which was provided to him. He immediately grabbed it and began to pretend to be a warrior. Thick clouds floated over the mountainous area, shrouding the treetops. The children's screams were heard. A huge sphere rolled after the guys who were trying to run away from it. The rabbit hovered in the air and watched as the ball rolled behind a group of guys. He told them that if they only looked ahead, something bad would definitely happen. The rabbit looked down on the guys, repeating his words that there were a lot of traps in this area. Suwu and a group of guys walked forward and frantically looked around. Suwu cast a grin behind him as he watched the other guys fall into the trap. The brunette took out his sword and continued to run forward, shouting to his remaining guys to look around, dodge, and run forward. The leader looked back angrily, shouting at the guys about why they were delaying, reminding them that if they stopped, they would die. Dawn was very tired and began to sigh from such a stormy run. He started to get very tired and was out of breath. In a sweat, he understood that his strength was running out. The silhouettes of the guys blurred in his eyes from fatigue. He knew he had to run after them. Suddenly, he stepped onto the platform, realizing that he had fallen into a trap. He looked down in shock, realizing that the ground was crumbling in front of him. His gaze immediately dropped, and he looked at what was happening in horror. Sumu looked back and saw that their friend had fallen into the hole. The brunette immediately became alarmed, trying to call out to his missing friend. The rabbit was floating in the air, waving his arms when a crowd of guys came back and inspected the pit. He mentioned to them that Trap 7 had an amazing effect, and he told them that there were traps in the ground too. The guy with the axe said that such things should have been warned in advance. The rabbit looked at the guys bloodthirstiest, trying to apologize to his comrade. Sumu rushed forward, shouting to his guys to run away too, testing the ground underneath them. At this time, the rabbit laughed maliciously and was amused. The guide at that time was flying through the air and watching the guys running away. He ironically spoke about the fact that he thought that the guys had a close relationship. He noticed that Mr. Suwu's composure was surprising to him. The brunette, with tears in his eyes and very embittered, continued to run forward with pain in his soul for his friend. He mentally apologized to Dawn. Chapter 2. Dawoon sat slumped in the spike-filled pit, his body trembling with exhaustion as he pressed a hand against his bleeding stomach. His breath came in shallow gasps, his face pale and slick with sweat. Above him, the guide addressed the group, oblivious to Dawoon's suffering. It's been a while since more than 10 people made it to the final stage, the guide praised, attributing their success to the sharp leadership of Suwu. Dawoon, barely conscious, looked like a shadow of himself, his gaze distant as the pain and exhaustion weighed him down. Pushing him closer to the brink of collapse, the rabbit, with a sly grin, warned the group to tread carefully. Dawoon, in his battered state, realized he could still hear the guide's voice, a faint reminder that he was clinging to life. His bloody hand rested on the ground just inches away from a knife that had mysteriously appeared beside him. As the pain dulled his senses, the guide's words cut through the haze. "There's always a boss in this stage," the guide announced, his tone growing more serious. "Allow me to introduce the final boss of this round." Dawoon's heart raced as he struggled to lift his head, fearing what might come. Dawoon sighed heavily, feeling the serenity of the situation with suffering. The guy was sitting in a hole near the iron spikes, with his hands down and his head covered in his blood. He remembered his guys, thinking that the end had come for him. Screams were heard that the guys were fighting the monster in the same spirit. The guys watched in shock as Sumu waved his blade at the huge M-Key monster. The final boss began to fall and crumble. The guys watched frantically as their leader smashed the boss to pieces. They were happy that they were finally able to defeat the final boss. The rabbit hovered in the air and looked enthusiastically at the brunette, admiring the actions of the fighter. The guide clasped his hands and became all embarrassed, blushing slightly. He noted that the guys were really great because he did not think that these weak people would ultimately be able to destroy the boss. He single-handedly praised Su Wu, who was able to defeat the boss even with one hand. All out of breath and tired, Su Wu looked angrily to the side and angrily asked if they could now return home. The rabbit looked at the guys in surprise, folding his palms. He noted why this should suddenly happen. The guide looked at the guys maliciously, opening his eyes wide. He told the guys to gather all their strength and energy and rush to the next game. An angry Su and his bewildered boys looked at the rabbit and tried to understand why this was happening. The brunette became very angry and looked at the rabbit in the sky. He shouted to him about what the guide told them last time. As soon as they finished the mission with the boss, the dungeon would be completed. The guide casually replied, "Exactly. You finished the first round, but now it's time for the next dungeon." Su, the leader, clenched his teeth in frustration, the weight of their situation sinking in as the exhausted group exchanged bewildered glances. The guy with the scar on his face spoke up, "Another dungeon? Already?" While the girl beside him echoed his disbelief. Wasn't this supposed to be just one round? The rabbit, grinning with malicious glee, raised his index finger, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "Oh, did you really think that was the end?" he asked with feigned innocence. "My deepest apologies," he continued, voice dripping with sarcasm. "I completely forgot to mention. This was just the beginning." His laughter filled the air as the group stood frozen in shock. Su Wu grabbed his sword and glared up at the rabbit. All his guys looked tired. He apologized for disappointing them and noted that the real game of the dungeon would begin right now. The brunette bared his teeth and looked angrily at the rabbit, along with the dumbfounded guys. He explained that it would be uninteresting when the game only had one round. He called them amateurs who had never played games since they were not happy about such a continuation of the moral fight. Su Wu, baring his teeth, heavily furrowed his eyebrows and looked at the rabbit. He said that they did not even have time to rest and did not have time to rest. He notified that the game was a dungeon that had to be mastered through death, so he was going to open the gate for a new round. The guide looked at the guys with enthusiasm, exclaiming why they were so sad. The guys fell to the ground and tried to catch their breath, clearly showing by their appearance that they had no strength. He realized that they were tired and had no strength, which put him into a stupor. The guide spread his arms to the sides and looked at the guys maliciously. Being high in the sky, he said that for such an occasion, there was a reward for completing the dungeon. The guys immediately jumped up and began to look around, trying to understand why the aura with healing was glowing all around. The guy in the bandage and the girl looked at their hands and noticed how their wounds were healing. Su Wu also raised his hand and looked at the healing in surprise. The rabbit spread his arms to the sides and joyfully looked at the guys, noting that this was a reward for completing the round, and now they should be happy. The guide was surprised that Su had 2 arms again, complimenting him that he looked much cooler now. He asked the guys if they were now full of strength and if they were ready to go through the second round. He noted that it would be worth starting again. Dawn sat in the hole, half dead, completely bloodied and exhausted. A notification appeared that the reward for 1 round is the full restoration of surviving players. Dawoon looked painfully at his hand, which began to heal. He examined his hands in amazement with the sweat of his brow, not understanding how his wounds could heal. A bright flash of light emitted rays of healing. Dawoon opened his mouth in surprise and examined his healed body. The rabbit asked the guys if everyone was happy now and told them to hurry up in order to quickly move on to the next second round. Dawoon cast a stunned glance to the side when he heard about the next round. 2. Dawoon spread his arms to the side and raised his head up, standing in a deep hole with spikes. He shouted that they should wait for him to take him with them because he was alive. The bright light of the afternoon sun illuminated the deep hole. Dawn, sighing heavily, looked up in bewilderment, realizing that the guys might not hear him. He grabbed his head and was very indignant, realizing that he could go crazy this way. He didn't understand what he should do here alone. Now, a notification appeared that the dungeon was restarting. He widened his eyes, resting his hands on his head. Realizing what was happening, he frantically looked at the yellow notification that the level was restarting that had popped up, standing in front of the bloody spikes. Drops of blood dripped from the spikes onto the ground. He washed in alarm as his blood began to float into the air and evaporate. He noticed this phenomenon and realized that his blood simply began to evaporate. He looked up with fear in his eyes and noticed that his hole was beginning to close. He realized that the trap entrance was closing again and the dungeon was restarting. He grabbed his knife as the ground began to crumble above him. Everything became clear to him because the rabbit said that there were previous participants. He frowned deeply and stated with his mouth open that preparations were underway for the next round for the other participants. Dawoon clutched a stone in his hand, being in a dark, closed pit with spikes. He immediately tensed up and cast an angry glance upward, about to throw a stone. He sharply threw the stone upward, intending to make himself known. The stone made a hole in the hole, and the bright light of the sun began to make its way into the dark hole. He covered himself with his hand as small fragments of stones and earth began to crumble. He looked out from under his long bangs and his arms up into the bright light of the sun. He understood that first he had to set off the trap device and was thinking about how he could get out of the hole. Thinking about the rope, he cast an alarmed glance at the sharp thorns, realizing that if he crawled up, he might fall and die. He crossed his arms and touched his chin, puzzled as he thought about the situation he found himself in. Suddenly, he widened his eyes, feeling fear and convulsion on his face. The rabbit did not understand what was happening. The guide flew into the hole, and Dawoon noticed him. The rabbit wondered why Dawn had not died yet. Dawoon looked dumbfounded at the rabbit, which was floating in the air. The guide replied that he came to this place because the trap suddenly started working, so he became curious about how Dawn was able to survive. He replied that he was almost dead, but he managed to live to be healed. The guide became very angry and clenched his paws. Dawn reminded him that in the event of a reward, there was a full restoration of the surviving players. Dawoon waved his arms and looked in bewilderment at the rabbit, who was frantically holding his head. The guide did not understand how this could happen because all the people who fell into this trap were immediately knocked out of the game and instant death occurred because it was very painful to fall. Dawoon replied that he survived anyway, so he had to be escorted to the other guys. The rabbit landed on the rocks and held his head worriedly as Dawn looked at him. The rabbit noted that it was not as easy as he thought. Dawoon was curious about what was so difficult about it. The rabbit flew up behind Dawn, who glanced at him. The guide realized that everything was confusing, so he told him to open his status window for a moment. Dawoon wondered why this had to be done. The guide told him not to ask unnecessary questions and to do as he told. The status window popped up. The name was unknown. Physical strength and feeling of satiety were at maximum, and the beginner's cleansing skill was level 7. The rabbit looked puzzled at the status window in front of which the guy stood. The guide realized that he had assumed that, according to the rules of the dungeon, he was listed as dead, not among survivors. Dawoon looked at the guide with enthusiasm, asking him if now he was not a participant and could return back to his world. The rabbit said that this was why Dawn must die here. The guide turned his back to Dawoon and was about to move away, while Dawn was very indignant and angry. He did not understand the reason for this decision. The rabbit replied that these were mistakes that could not be corrected, so they had to be hushed up. Dawoon tried to reach with his hand. The rabbit briefly stopped in the air and angrily inspected its umbrella. The rabbit said it should look as natural as possible. Dawoon did not understand how this was possible. Dawoon looked frantically at the guide as spikes protruded from behind him. The guide noted that Dawn was still doing chores behind Sun. Wu's back and still wouldn't be able to get out of here without the skills. The guide waved his umbrella and looked at the guy happily. He noted that the dungeon restart did not only occur in the trap. Dawn, being in the depths of the pit, watched the guide, who was about to fly out of the pit. The guide looked down at the guide, bloodthirsty, holding a red umbrella. He noted that even if Dawn could get out, there would still be complete hell going on at the top, so he suggested that he just die peacefully from hunger. He told him not to interfere with other people's games and to just die alone. The rabbit, with an ironic expression on his face, rushed to fly away from the pit. When Dawoon tried to call him, the bright light of the sun penetrated into the deep hole. Dawoon angrily looked up from under his brows, realizing that he was not going to die quietly here. He remembered the image of a rabbit. Holding his umbrella, he realized that he was not worthy of such a death because he was simply doing chores. He also remembered a nasty guy with glasses who despised him. He recalled his situation when he looked upset. He was in a deep hole, and a blue screen with an inventory of things appeared in front of him. He smirked about how someone could just die if asked. He told the guide not to dare to despise him just because he was an ordinary worker. He took out a piece of meat and held the bone tightly. He bloodthirstily grabbed the meat with his teeth and noted that he would definitely survive. Chapter 3. Remains of food and several bones, including fish, lay on the ground. Dawoon sighed with relief, holding his full belly with his hand, realizing that he had eaten very well. It seemed to him that this was the first time in the last month that he had been able to eat in peace. He looked up with slight bewilderment, holding his full belly. He understood that this situation seemed ironic because this was just paradise compared to the time when he was constantly running away from monsters and had to stand on the night watch. Dawoon rested his hand on the ground and looked up at the exit from the pit. He realized that he could not stay here and sit like this all his life. And then rock. He abruptly crossed his arms and closed his eyes, looking puzzled. He did not understand what to do in this case. He understood that even if he somehow managed to rise, monsters would immediately await him. But the pit had a high ceiling and strong walls around it. He bent, slightly in front of the sharp thorns, his gaze caught on a small, empty plot of land. He looked back carefully, realizing that he could dig a hole. He imagined how he dug a tunnel out of this terrible place and freed himself. He understood that first he had to dig down and then to the side. He realized that if he moved away from the stone wall, he could get out. He bent over the ground and clasped his hands, realizing that it might look reckless. He immediately contorted his face and looked angry. He understood that there was nothing to do here anyway, and even more so, it would be safer in another place, so he still decided to try his luck. He was wiping the sweat from his face, looking very tired after deciding to dig a tunnel with a joyful expression on his face. He turned back, adjusting his collar, looking very out of breath. He wondered, when you constantly feel a threat to your life, your head might start to work worse. He didn't understand what was so fun about this action, which is why he wasn't a little excited. He examined his palms and saw bloody calluses on them. He saw that he had torn off all his hands, but he had no choice, and therefore he had to survive. Suddenly, a small stone fell on his head, and he became slightly angry. He sat near the dug cave and held his head. He saw that now he had a problem with the ground, and thus he could completely bury himself alive. Suddenly, the realization hit him, and he turned back, puzzled, holding his head. He was interested to know if it was possible to keep the land in inventory. He reached his hand towards the blue inventory screen. He threw a piece of earth into the blue screen and looked at it, dumbfounded. He saw that the inventory had been replenished by one lump of earth. He was slightly surprised that it could actually be used. He looked gloatingly at the blue inventory screen. Placing his hands on his belt, he exhaled and understood that now there was no need to worry that he would bury himself alive, because now the work would go faster. He squeezed a piece of earth tightly in his hands. He began to sharply dig a tunnel, throwing pieces of earth into the inventory screen. He looked at the glowing blue screen with enthusiasm. He was glad that the inventory reflected the amount of earth he had dug. He realized that this was 100 times more fun than constantly running away from someone. He sped a look at his hands, trying to understand what was happening to him. A notification appeared, stating that this was the first achievement and he had acquired a new skill. He stared wide-eyed and concerned at what was happening, realizing he had acquired a new skill. It was a yellow notice with the process of creating a new skill. He spread his arms to the sides and felt the radiance of the aura on himself with peace, understanding the brutality of the achievement. This was the first time he had experienced such sensations. He bulged his eyes and looked forward angrily, realizing that in this state he could break everyone. He laughed hard at what was happening. A skill card came out, Earthball Master, and now he could dig earthballs even better. He collapsed to the ground as if exhausted in front of the yellow skill screen. He bared his teeth slightly and frowned indignantly. He didn't understand what this skill was. A card with a description of the skill appeared in front of him. He could roll earth lumps even faster and better, and as the level increased, make harder and larger lumps. He understood that his first skill was very simple, so he couldn't even talk about this improved skill, because he considered it shameful. He reflected that he might not have been meant to fight. He frowned slightly and raised his exhausted palms upward, sighing heavily. He understood in general why he acquired this particular skill, because he was still digging the ground. He closed his eyes and sighed languidly, thinking about whether he would never have such fighting skills as Suwu, because he knew that his leader had cool skills. His gaze was very downcast. He recalled an incident where Su looked angry and shouted angrily. He thought about how Su was basically always causing trouble, but despite this, even when he lost his arm, he was still ready to save him. Dawn sat in his dug cave looking sad. He hoped that Su was okay and couldn't just die. Suddenly, he exclaimed and remembered something. He looked at the blue screen confused. He was trying to check how well he was now making earth lumps since he had such a skill. He raised his hand off the ground and began to form a lump using his mana. He clutched in his hand an earth lump glowing blue. He sweetly watched the lump, trying to understand what it was. A pile of thorns stuck out in the deep hole in which a tunnel had been dug. A rabbit's paw appeared above the tunnel. He grabbed his face and was very indignant, standing in front of the dug tunnel. He hoped that the guy would die peacefully in this pit. The guy grinned sarcastically, realizing that Dawn still wouldn't really do anything below. With his swinging legs, he licked his paw and rushed to fall down into the tunnel, thinking that the guy had probably already spent everything or died. He was curious to know how much Dawun had managed to dig up. The guy continued to fly into the deep hole, surprised that he had already dug a decent amount. The rabbit continued to gallop along the deep tunnel, realizing the stamina and strength of the main character. He understood that Don could stay alive for so long without having any abilities. He thought that this could all happen thanks to Sue's skills. The guide jumped off the ground deep into the pit. He believed that the player would fail. The guide continued to follow the tunnel, trying to make ironic jokes about whether the guide had turned into a cat. The guide was slightly stunned as he flew through the expanses of the tunnel. He thought he saw a body. The guide, sweating, looked ahead in horror, realizing that the passage into the tunnel was becoming wider. The rabbit examined the burning torch in horror. He didn't understand what was really happening. He flew past the burning row of torches in horror, not understanding why he needed all these unnecessary things. Suddenly, Dawoon walked with a contented gait in front of the rabbit, with a plate of meat. Don cast a stunned glance to the side when he saw the guide. Dawoon timidly waved his hand to the rabbit as a sign of greeting, causing the guide to fall into a stupor. The guide was very indignant and waved his fists while Dawoon ironically looked away. The rabbit did not understand why the guy had not died yet and how it all happened. The guy widened his eyes and looked to the side in amazement. He saw a small makeshift bed in front of him. He also saw a homemade table with dishes made from mud, realizing that such a thing had never happened in the cave before. The rabbit was in a stupor when he saw a whole furnished dwelling in the cave. Chapter 4. Dawoon opened his inventory and took out an earthen lump from it. He placed it on the table, made a deep mold out of it, and poured water into it. Dawoon sharply waved his hand over the earthen lump, giving it shape. From a lump of dirt, Don managed to make a plate, which he stared at. The guide looked at Don with bewilderment while sitting at the table. The guide asked Don what he was doing. Don closed his eyes, placing a large piece of meat on his plate. He told the guide that he was a guest after all and he needed to treat him with something. The guide rested his head on his paw, watching as Don cut off a piece of meat. The guide was shocked that the cave had already become his home, asking if he really had to eat this. The guide narrowed his eyes, looking displeased at the main character. The guide said that if you think about it, then Dawoon was a worker in charge of food, then asked him that he had food. That's why he behaved like that. Dawoon looked at the guide in confusion, raising his eyebrows. The guide noted that Dawoon must have acquired some kind of skill. The guide asked Dawoon what skill he had acquired. Dawoon looked to the side in embarrassment, raising his hand to his mouth. He said that he had acquired the skill of rolling earthen lumps. The rabbit laughed at what he heard. He slammed his paw on the table, smiling widely and pointing his finger at the protagonist. The rabbit noted that he still could not understand that he had made everything so well. The rabbit waved its tail, looking at the main character. He asked Dawoon if he was really gaining useless skills. Dawoon clenched his lips, looking displeased at the guide. The guide said that the first purification skill was also very strange, noting that it was interesting. Although in the end, all the efforts were in vain. Dawoon looked in surprise at the guide, who jumped from his chair to the ground. The guide told Dawoon that now all he had to do was die. Don looked at the guide warily, knitting his eyebrows. He asked the rabbit if he would kill him. The rabbit turned his head, looking irritably at Don. He said that Dawoon himself would soon die, asking him why he would get his hands dirty. The guide put his paws behind his back and happily galloped towards the exit. The guide noted that it was apparently already over. Dawoon looked at the rabbit in shock, widening his eyes. He asked the rabbit what was over. Dawoon turned his head behind his back, looking at how everything in the cave shook. He didn't understand what was happening. The guy flew into the air, looking at Dawoon while the stones fell to the ground. The rabbit told Don that while he was having fun there and rolling lumps, the following players had already completed one round. The rabbit smiled bloodthirstily, narrowing his eyes. He told Don that he had built such a hut in vain, asking him if he regretted it now. Don looked at the guide in bewilderment. His mouth parted. A plate of meat fell from the table, breaking him on the ground. Dawoon widened his eyes, looking down. Don looked at the passage of the cave where huge stones were falling. Don was confused, not understanding why he didn't think of it, and while he was digging a hole, he completely forgot. Dawoon frowned, watching what was happening with irritation. He thought that he had forgotten about starting the dungeon, which meant everything he dug up would also be restarted. Don planted his foot on the ground and rushed towards the exit of the cave. Dawoon said that we must quickly return to that trap. The guide happily watched the protagonist, smiling widely. He was shocked that Dawoon was trying to get out of there, noting that he actually had fortitude. Dawoon fell to the ground from a boulder that fell nearby. The rabbit asked what he should do, noting that it was apparently hard for him. Dawoon lay on the ground as the cave collapsed. The rabbit said that it was still very far from the exit, noting that he said why they had to dig so hard. Dawoon bared his teeth, clenched them, and looked straight ahead. Don rested his knees and hands on the ground, lowering his head. The rabbit asked Don if he was giving up, to which Dawoon said that this was probably the end. The rabbit noted that he had been through a lot. The guide spread his paws to the sides, smiling widely. He told Don that as a result he dug his own grave. noting that he told him to just die quietly. The guide tilted his head to the side, looking at Dawoon with an insidious gaze. He told Dawn that he was trying in vain. The guide turned his head to the side, looking at the walls of the cave. Dawoon looked shabby, looking at what was happening in bewilderment. Dawoon widened his eyes in surprise. He noted that everything had stopped. The rabbit looked at what was happening in confusion, his mouth slightly open. He said that this could not happen, not understanding how this was possible. The rabbit grabbed his head with his paws while Dawn looked at him dumbfounded. The rabbit noted that the reboot was over, but everything in the cave remained the same. Dawoon widened his eyes while a system, window with symbols in the name line, was open in front of him. The rabbit noted that it was a mistake. Due to this stupid mistake, wondering if this applies to the rules of the dungeon as well. The rabbit nervously waved his paws in the air as Dawoon rose to his feet. Dawn asked the rabbit if the reboot was already over, to which the guide replied that he did not know and should not ask him. Dawoon knitted his eyebrows, looking to the side at the cave. The guide said that it infuriates him, not understanding what it is. Dawoon smiled with relief, looking at the whole cave. He thought everything was a mess, but it didn't reboot. Dawoon lowered his gaze, looking down dejectedly. He didn't understand why, thinking it was because he was a mistake. Dawoon recalled the moment when a light aura began to emanate from him, after which he widened his eyes. He thought that it might be that due to a mistake, the rules of the dungeon now did not apply to him, noting that he had received a reward after all. Dawn thought that in general he is a player but does not count as a player. The guide approached Dawoon from behind, looking displeased at the back of his head. The guide asked Dawn what he was thinking about so intently. The rabbit narrowed his eyes, looking angrily at the protagonist. He said that there was no need to be so happy. In any case, he will die sooner or later. Dawn narrowed his eyes slightly and turned his head behind his back, looking at the angry rabbit. The guy said that perhaps during the next reboot, everything there would be destroyed or huge monsters would be discovered underground. Dawoon looked at the rabbit indifferently. The guide told Dawn that he would definitely die eventually, asking him what his facial expression was and that he was so afraid that he couldn't even control his facial expressions. Dawn opened his mouth slightly, looking at the rabbit with narrowed eyes, which made him surprised. Dawn asked the guide if he couldn't kill him. The guide looked at Dawoon in confusion, raising his paws in front of him. Dawn said that it's true. If he so wants his death, then he can, like that time, cut his throat, and that's all. Dawoon walked back to his cave with an imposing step, whistling a melody, while the rabbit was furious. The guide said that he could cut his throat, noting that he was simply ridiculous, asking how he even thought of such a thing. The rabbit said that he just didn't want to get his hands dirty. The rabbit waved its paws furiously while Dawoon walked with an indifferent expression on his face. The rabbit asked Dawn why he was ignoring him, noting that he would actually cut him off. The rabbit asked Dawn if he could really cut his throat. Dawoon smiled insidiously, baring his teeth and looking at the rabbit. He thought that he didn't know for what reason, but he couldn't kill him himself. The guide stopped waving his arms, looking at the protagonist's back. The guide looked downcast, his lips pursed. He thought it was a failure. A small pebble bounced off the wall, bouncing across the floor. Everything happened as Dawn expected. The rabbit had only one right to kill the player. The guide clutched his head in confusion, looking down in shock. He used it at the very beginning to take control, and now there was no way to personally harm Dawn. Dawoon looked behind him at the guide, putting his hands in his pockets. The guide thought that if Dawn really came out, noting that if they found out about his mistake from above, then he would be finished. Dawoon told the rabbit that he would have dinner, asking him if he really didn't want it. Dawoon looked sideways at the guide while stones began to fall in front of him. He told the guide that if he didn't want to, then so be it. Dawoon raised one eyebrow, looking at the ceiling of the cave with confusion. Suddenly, the wall began to collapse. A strong stream of water gushed out of the hole, knocking Dawoon off his feet. The guide from above watched as a stream of water enveloped the main character. Dawn didn't understand what was happening. The rabbit noted that the cave had burst. The rabbit looked at what was happening with enthusiasm, sparkling with joy. He said that the cave was broken through by an underground stream. Dawoon raised his hand, covering his face with his hand while the rabbit laughed at him. The rabbit asked Dawn what he thought he would survive, noting that the underground stream was right there. The rabbit told Dawn to just die and let him drown since he was a mistake. Dawoon closed one eye, being almost completely underwater. Chapter 5. A strong stream of water covered the main character's head, because of which only his hand was visible. Dawn thought he was doing badly. The cave began to fill with an endless stream of water. Water filled the passage in the cave while the torches continued to burn. The flow of water was strong, flooding the room. Dawoon emerged from the water, mouth wide open, inhaling air. Dawoon frowned, looking at the water. He opened the inventory. Dawn extended his hand in front of him as the system window opened in front of him. Dawoon opened his mouth wide, continuing to sweat in a strong stream of water. He said he would stop her with all the dirt he had. Dawoon closed his eyes, stretching his hands in front of him, removing lumps of dirt from his inventory. The guide closed his eyes, watching what was happening in irritation. Dawoon looked at the lumps of dirt while the rabbit looked at everything dejectedly. The rabbit asked Don if he was serious, to which he replied that he was full of confidence. The rabbit put his paw to his head. Looking at Dawoon Ho lowered his head down. The rabbit said that Don must have gone completely crazy since he was trying to plug the dam with his finger. Don bared his teeth, clenching them. He said that one finger, of course, was weak, but this number would be enough. The rabbit widened his eyes in surprise, looking at what was happening. The guy was shocked by what Dawoon was doing. He didn't understand what it was. Endless lumps of dirt began to appear from the protagonist's inventory, plugging the dam. The rabbit asked Dawoon why he had so much dirt and how much he had collected in his inventory. Dawoon pursed his lips, looking away to the side. He thought it was time to stop underestimating him. Dawoon spread his arms to the side, baring his teeth, looking at the hole in the wall. Dawoon covered the hole with dirt without stopping, putting his hands forward. He thought that by collecting all the dirt from his inventory, he would stop the flow. Lumps of dirt covered the hole in the wall. The flow of water was so strong that it came out of the cracks. Dawoon stood at the sealed wall, watching the water splash from the cracks. Dawoon widened his eyes, watching what was happening in shock. He thought that it could not withstand the water pressure. Dawoon looked at the wall in bewilderment, holding a lump of dirt in his hand. He thought about a shape that would withstand pressure, and what if the shape was not spherical? System unification, mud shaper. You can create larger and stronger pieces of mud as you increase the level. Dawoon noted that it did not say that the dirt must be spherical. Dawoon pursed his lips, looking at the lump of dirt in his hand. He wondered if he could change its form. Dawoon raised his hands and opened his mouth wide, trying to form a different lung shape. The rabbit thought that he had clearly gone crazy. A strong stream of water gushed out of the cracks, almost knocking Don off his feet as he worked his magic over the lump of dirt. A lump of dirt hovered above the protagonist's hand, emitting a golden light. Don mentally prayed for him to change. A lump of mud took the shape of a brick, while the protagonist's hand stuck out of the water. The protagonist, once underwater, smiled sarcastically, looking at the brick. The guide looked dumbfounded at what had happened, his mouth open. The rabbit said that this couldn't happen. Dawoon built a wall of bricks covering a hole in the wall. Don rested his hands on his knees, lowering his head, as the water all drained away. The rabbit thought that he had managed to stop the flow. After all, Don said that he thought that now he would definitely die. Don furrowed his eyebrows, looking at the rabbit with displeasure. He told the rabbit that everything was going through one place from the moment he came there, asking him if he wanted to make fun of him for his eyes. The rabbit landed on the ground, closing his eyes angrily. The guide told Don that then he should just give up and die. Don fell to the ground, completely wet, as the guide walked closer to him. Don said that he was very cold, noting that he almost died. Then the guide said that Dawoon was tenacious like a cockroach. The guide looked at the tired and wet main character, who was sitting in a puddle of water. The guide thought that he had stopped the flow from the water vein. The rabbit turned his gaze to the wall he had built of lumps of dirt. The guide thought that he was making this a skill that allowed him to change the shape of dirt, noting that this was impossible even with combat skills. The guide narrowed his eyes, watching the main character. The guide said Don was too dangerous to be kept alive. Dawoon went to his maid room, waving to the guide. Don called out to the guide, saying that this was cool. The guide asked the player if they were now friends. The player smiled contentedly and raised his eyebrows. He said he was calm now, and the guy came out of the tunnel, noticing a small body of water, while the guide hovered behind him. The guy was surprised the pond appeared there. The guide asked the guy what if it was poisoned. The rabbit added that he would probably get diarrhea and die from stomach pain. Dawoon squatted down, leaning towards the water, while the guide trembled convulsively. Dawoon extended his hand to the pond, after which it lit up. Don used the purification skill. The guy was shocked by what Don did. Dawoon turned his head to the side, looking at the angry rabbit. Don said that now he could drink it. The rabbit thought that he was an annoying, tenacious scoundrel. Dawoon pursed his lips, looking down at the shining water. He rose to his feet as the guide continued to watch the protagonist. The guide asked the player what he would do now. The player noted that they now had a pond. He looked at the guide with a smile beaming with joy. The player said they could get some nice interior decoration. The guide stated that they did not need her. The player stretched out his hands in front of him, opening his inventory, simultaneously laying out bricks by the pond. The guide watched as Dawoon built a stone wall of bricks around the pond. He noted that he made it in an instant, thinking that his skills had improved after stopping the flow. Dawoon walked up to the wall, sticking out his tongue and making a figure on the wall while the rabbit watched him in surprise. The rabbit asked the guy what he was doing now, to which the guy replied that this was the highlight of their design. The rabbit watched as Dawoon sculpted the shape of a lion's head. Dawoon said it was a lion head fountain. The guy thought the head looked more like a cat that had been struck by lightning. The player extended his hand in front of him, putting it into the lion's mouth. The player looked at the head, smiling slightly. He used the mud shaping skill. Dawoon pulled out a stone from the lion's mouth from where a stream of water began to flow, while the rabbit opened his mouth in shock. The guide narrowed his eyes in irritation, furrowing his brows. He said that Don does whatever he wants now, asking him why he wasted decorating everything. Dawoon looked at the rabbit with bewilderment, holding a lump of dirt in his hand. He asked the rabbit in what sense he was doing this in vain and whether he understood how scientific the design was. A pipe was visible in the pond attached to the wall. Dawoon asked the rabbit if he could see the pipe, noting that it connected to the water vein from where the water came. The pipe was attached to the lion's head, under which arrows indicated where the water was moving. Don told the rabbit that of course this was a good solution to reduce the water pressure and subsequent rush, but it also avoided stagnation of water. The guy sat by the pond while Dawoon looked at the rabbit with an insidious smile, resting his fingers against each other. Don said that he should remark by asking the guide, "Isn't this a gorgeous design that only a genius can do?" The guide reluctantly said it was cool. The player asked the rabbit if he would receive an achievement for this. Dawoon looked in front of him in surprise, seeing a bright golden light. A system notification had appeared, obtaining an achievement saying that Dawoon built a pond with a fountain in the shape of a lion's head. Dawoon opened his mouth slightly, looking at the achievement in bewilderment. The rabbit grimaced with displeasure, squinting his eyes from the bright light. The pond shone brightly with a bright light, which was watched by the shocked guys. The guy noted that he received an achievement for such stupidity. A system alert had appeared. Reward: now there are fish in that pond. Chapter 6. System alert. Achievement received. A pond with a fountain in the shape of a lion's head was built. Reward: now fish have appeared in that pond. Dawoon looked at the achievement in surprise while the rabbit watched what was happening with displeasure. Dawoon collapsed to the ground while the rabbit covered his face with his paws from the bright light. A small fish appeared in the pond. Don leaned towards the water, happily watching the fish while the guide looked sadly into the pond. Don noted that there were fish in the pond. The guide said it was impossible, not understanding how it even happened. Don smiled widely, looking at the guide with sparkling eyes. Don said that this was really cool, and now he wouldn't die of hunger, noting that he had water and fish. The guide thought he should just die. Don closed his eyes, wiping away tears with his hand and biting his lower lip. He said his efforts had reached the skies. Dawoon spread his hands to the sides, clenching them into a fist, while the guide looked at him indignantly. The player said that the gods were helping him, to which the guide told him to stop hoping. An orange sunset could be seen in the sky, while a column of smoke came from the forest. A column of steam rose from the pit and was located in the middle of the forest. Dawoon stood by the fire, frying food on a grid of sticks, while the guide dejectedly watched what was happening, sitting against the wall. Don noted that this was instant barbecue, asking the bunny if it didn't look delicious. The rabbit rested his head on his paw, wearily watching the cooking. The rabbit noted that the valuable equipment of the dungeon was used to grill meat. The guy put a piece of meat on a stick, looking at the rabbit. The guy asked the guy that he was wondering why he hadn't thought of this before, to which the rabbit replied that it was probably because he was stupid. Dawoon closed his eyes, drooling over the juicy meat. He said that at least now he knew what made him happy. The player placed the meat on the grill, turning his head towards the guide, who looked at him in surprise. The player asked the guide what must be wrong. He was hungry. The guide noted that it was he who suggested that he fry the meat over the fire. The guide moved his paw to the side, closing one eye, looking at Don. The guide asked Don if that wasn't how everyone ate, noting that it gave the food a smoky flavor or something like that. The guy looked indifferently at the guide, who clenched his paws into a fist. The guy told the guide that if he wasn't hungry, he could just leave. The rabbit said that he would do whatever he wanted and would leave after seeing his corpse. The player closed his eyes slightly, looking at the rabbit with a smile. He thanked the guide, noting that he was already starting to get tired of the monotonous food. The rabbit looked at the main character, relaxed. Dawoon approached the rabbit, squatting down and handing him meat on a stick. Dawoon told the rabbit that since he gave him the idea, he should thank him. The rabbit narrowed his eyes slightly, looking at the meat with indifference. After a moment, the rabbit began to salivate, looking at the juicy and tasty meat. The guide closed his eyes, wiping the saliva with his paw and pointing his finger at the main character. The guide refused the meat, telling Dawoon to put it away, as he was not interested in what he was eating. Dawoon confusedly asked the guide if this was true, to which the guide replied that he did not eat such crappy food. Dawoon widened his eyes and opened his mouth slightly as if it had dawned on him. He rose to his feet, holding the bridge of his nose with his hand and closing his eyes, while the rabbit looked at him angrily, clenching his paws into a fist. Dawoon said that he was a little stupid, noting that rabbits are herbivores, and asked the guide for forgiveness. The guide said that he could eat meat since he was a special rabbit, so he could feed on it, noting that he just didn't want to. Dawoon turned to the fire while the rabbit stomped its paws in anger. Dawoon noted that there was no grass there either. The guide asked Dawn if he was now making fun of him. The guide asked Dawoon what he really thought, that he couldn't just kill him, and whether he understood this. The fire continued to burn, slowly dying out. There were bones and water bottles on the floor. Dawoon was fast asleep on the bed, while the guide watched over him. The guide got closer to the main character, who was sleeping carefree. The rabbit noted that just by looking at him, he must be the calmest participant in the entire history of the dungeon. Dawoon shook his head in his sleep and muttered, which made the rabbit surprised. Dawoon talked to Sonu in his sleep. The rabbit squinted at the protagonist, wondering what kind of dream he was having. The guide raised his paws, flying into the air, leaving his shadow on the floor. The guide said everything was fine. The guide smiled insidiously, putting his paws together, looking at the guy. The guide noted that it is easy to sleep in this world. Smoke was coming from a small fire while bones were scattered around it. The rabbit said that without even knowing what he had done, smoke rose from the cave into the forest. The guide said that the monsters in the dungeon are always hungry, asking the sleeping Dawn if he could survive in a cave with no way out. The full moon shone in the sky, while the red eyes of predators next to the hole could be seen from the bushes. The guide smiled maliciously, looking at Dawoon with bloody eyes. He said he hoped he had a wonderful last meal. The protagonist was fast asleep in his cave, his mouth slightly open. Dawn asked in a dream to be given to him just one piece. Dawn furrowed his eyebrows, continuing to sleep soundly and hum in his sleep. An animal appeared in the cave and crushed a bone with its hoof. The boar stood near the cave, sparkling with his bloodthirsty eyes. The cave began to rattle, causing ripples to appear in the pond. The fire on the torches began to move in different directions from the strong blow, after which the flames calmed down. A huge boar appeared in front of the protagonist, releasing smoke from its nostrils. Dawoon said in a dream that he also wanted a pork belly. The boar approached the sleeping protagonist, sparkling red eyes. The boar began to sniff Dawn's body, causing him to slightly turn onto his back. Dawn muttered to the man in his sleep to forget and not touch him. The boar brought its nose close to the face of the protagonist, who opened his mouth slightly. He said he's not crazy. Dawoon jumped up in his sleep, violently hitting the boar on the head. Dawn said that he's not crazy and let him eat his own pork belly. Dawn woke up from his sleep, rubbing his hand over one eye and looking at the boar. The protagonist's eyes seemed to fly out, seeing a huge and angry boar in front of him. He was surprised by the horn boar. Dawoon looked at the boar cowardly, covered in cold sweat. He thought he was still sleeping. The boar hit the main character's bed with its horns, causing him to jump to the side. Dawn was convinced that he was no longer sleeping. The player looked dumbfounded at his destroyed bed, standing next to the bloodthirsty boar. The player thought that if he just scratched him, he was a dead man. Dawn held his hands out in front of him, standing in front of the angry boar. Dawoon asked the boar how he was doing and whether he understood him like the rabbit. Dawoon frowned, watching the beast in horror. He asked the beast that he had accidentally hit him, adding that if he had hit him, he would apologize to him. The beast opened its mouth slightly, drooling, looking at the player in disbelief. The player thought that it meant he was just hungry. The player bent his knees slightly, raising his hand and looking at the monster with tears in his eyes. The guy did not understand how this beast appeared there, out of nowhere, noting that he felt sick from this dying fear. Dawoon began to remember Sunwoo, who was looking straight ahead with a confident look. Sugmu said that they need to focus as their strength is ridiculous. Sugmu got into a fighting pose as the angry boar charged at him. Sugmu said that horned boars have predictable behavior and are also stupid. Dawoon thought about what if Sugmu were in his place. Sugmu dodged the attack from the angry boar. Sugmu said to dodge to the side. The boar was about to attack Dawoon while he stood opposite him, terrified. Dawoon thought that this is what Sayu would do. Dawoon wondered if he could do the same. The guy bared his teeth as sweat ran down his face. Dawoon thought that he was just in charge of the creation and he had no fighting skills at all. Dawoon widened his eyes, looking at his opponent. He moved his hand behind his back, from which a golden light appeared while the beast rushed towards him, its red eye flashing Chapter 7. Dawn thought about what if, just for a second, he formed a ball of dirt in his hand. The white space was filled with a black and red aura. Dawoon stretched out his hands in front of him, building a wall of bricks. Don hurriedly climbed the wall away from the monster. Dawoon jumped into the air, dodging the beast's attack. He thought maybe he could do this. The boar rammed its head into the constructed wall, clenching its mouth. Shards of stones fell from the ceiling. The head of the demonic boar punched a hole. Don jumped to the side and dodged the blow. Then he looked at it with alarm and thought that he had broken the mud wall like a sand castle. Afterwards, Dawoon jumped to the side, squatting down, and thought that he even stopped the breakthrough of the vein with this wall. The outlines of a monster were visible in the cloud of dust, and the hero thought that they were not lying when they said that this was the apex predator of the first stage. The boar walked towards him with eyes red from rage, and he continued his thought, thinking that this was excellent strength and endurance, and one mistake would cost his life. A moment later, he spread his hands, opening his inventory and shouting about it. Bricks began to fall out in front of him, and he worriedly thought that in any case, this is all that can be done now. A man in a red t-shirt put a brick on the wall, and thought that if one wall failed, he would make several. Afterwards, the guy looked forward seriously and told the monster to try to get through it. Although he didn't know how stupid he is, the hero stood on top of the wall into which the boar was already running and said that it would not break so easily and urged him to speed up. The creature rested its horn against the wall. Dawoon staggered and became nervous, making a sound of failure. The wall beneath him collapsed and shattered into smithereens, and he, falling from it, said that this was madness and asked how he broke it so easily. While the man in the red t-shirt was in the air and watching what was happening, he thought that things were bad and he was much stronger than expected. In this case, the monster began to slow down. The hero stood on the ground and looked at the cloud of dust, thinking that the water vein would break through again because of his violence. Seeing his room being torn apart, he exclaimed about it. Dawoon pursed his lip and thought sadly that he had wasted a lot of time on her. Then he spread his arms to the side, opening the panel. The guy's hands were shaking, and he said that you couldn't break through the scoundrel so easily and said that it was time for the main ability he was working on. The boar looked at him questioningly and growled. A piece of stone began to emerge from the panel that appeared. The boar got scared and growled questioningly. The hero looked down and asked if he had ever heard about a targeted bomb. Then he tensed up and shouted that any monster would die from one blow. The monster looked with alarm and squealed. Dawoon still held the stone above his head and said that it was a special, targeted mud bomb, but then the weight of a boulder fell on his hands. The stone pressed him, and he made a questioning sound. He was still able to create a small explosion, but the boar remained meaningfully silent. The builder was able to throw it a little forward and disgraced himself. He looked at the remains of the boulder and sent a significant silence. Afterwards, the guy laughed anxiously and said that it seemed he would live. The animal exhaled through its nose with aggression. He began to run away from him as fast as he could in tears and thought that he was done for. And then thought that he had never had enough strength to leave her. Then he began to create steps from stone and asked it to stop. But after a moment, the hero was stunned by something. He was hit by a powerful blow and was thrown back. Blood gushed from his mouth. He still fell to the ground. Stones fell from the ceiling. The man in the red t-shirt began to get up from the ground. His body was trembling, and he thought that it wasn't even a direct blow when it already hurt like hell. Looking at the boar, he thought that he had nowhere to run. The hero exhaled heavily and thought about what he should do now. The boar turned, and he continued his thought, thinking that at this rate he would definitely die, and there must be another way out. And this scoundrel, that he imagined the roasted boar meat on the fire and thought that if he could deal with it. A moment later, Dawoon imagined a dead boar lying nearby and him frying its meat. It suddenly dawned on him, and he realized that he wanted a barbecue made from pork stomach, and the taste of fat that he had dreamed of could now be tasted. The guy put his palms to the floor, creating structures. The builder looked out from behind the wall with a wild smile and called on him to go down on him, calling him a pork stomach. The wall had already been erected, and the boar was rushing towards it. He used the mud formation without stopping. The boar's eyes were fierce, but then after he broke through the wall, he began to fall into the hole, and the hero stood on top of another wall. He looked at him with a sly smile and asked if he was here, saying that he thought it was time for them to stop running around. The monster fell on its side and roared, then he looked up with an angry look. The builder still stood on the wall and asked why he was looking at him like that and said that it seemed that he did not understand what would happen to him afterwards. He straightened his hair and said that he was furious, and then asked if he knew how long it took him to build all this and asked how he was going to compensate for it all. He asked if he would help him in the restoration of this place. The boar sat down in horror and growled questioningly, and he said that he believed that it would be difficult for him afterwards. The hero's face became stupid, and he asked if he would pay with his carcass and said that the monster treated him with disrespect. Stones began to fall from the panel above him and hit the monster, and departing builder said goodbye to him. The guide watched all this and remained significantly silent. The rabbit was in frantic shock and asked about what he just saw. The hero winked at him, and he continued, asking what kind of person he was, and asked if he really only crafted. His name was hidden on his panel, and he continued by saying that it was just a dirt formation that was useless, and then asked if it could really be used like that.